more Socratic method, we're looking at the Socratic method of argumentation. Socrates had three main methods to show flaws in definitions, and this tradition of assessing definitions continues to this day. So what Socrates did back then in ancient Greece is still relevant to arguing and assessing things today. They're a standard part of a typical critical thinking class when talking about definitions. So the first tactic or method he had was this. He would have a definition, say, of loyalty or virtue, and he would begin by finding a structural flaw in the definition. So you may be familiar with how like a building or a car or a plane can have a structural flaw, a weak point that can cause it to fail, perhaps unfortunately disastrously. So what would be structural flaws in a definition? Well, for Socrates, there are the following flaws. First is that the definition could be circular, which is to say the definition simply runs you back to itself. And the problem is, even though running around a track in a circle can be good for your heart, a definition that runs you back to where it started leads you nowhere. You gain nothing. To use a very simple, perhaps silly example, suppose we're trying to define loyalty. And we define loyalty as what a loyal person has. And that would clearly be a circular definition because essentially it says loyalty is loyalty, which is true, but tells you nothing. It'd be like if someone was talking about, to make up a silly example, if someone said glub is what a glub person has. And what's glub? And the answer is you can't tell from that definition. Second problem is that the definition takes the part of something to be the whole thing. To use an example from Socrates, if someone uses justice to explain virtue, when justice is a part of virtue, I mean, true, it will give you some inkling into that part, but does not account for the whole thing. Third problem is that a definition can provide just a list of specific examples without giving the actual common property. For example, in the dialogue The Euthyphro, in which Socrates is talking about piety, what Euthyphro does when asked, what is piety, what is it to be pious, Euthyphro just lists a few actions, things like going to temple, sacrificing some animals to the gods, that type of stuff. And that doesn't really tell you what pious is. It just gives you examples of actions. It doesn't tell you what they all have in common. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially if you take or have taken the critical inquiry course, there is a type of definition known as definition by example, sometimes called the ostensive definition, which involves giving examples by pointing to stuff. So, on the one hand, you can define things by giving examples or by pointing to things. And you kind of have to hope that the person gets what it is you're trying to do. So if you were to say, for example, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, those could be obviously presidents. That could be what it's trying to define. Could be Americans. Could be names. Could be people who have streets named after them. So it could be many things. So although the definition by example is a legitimate form of example, Socrates' criticism is giving examples doesn't tell you what they all have in common. And for Socrates, you need to know what they all have in common to have a proper definition. Another tool used by Socrates, which is something we talked about way back when we were talking about argument basics, is the reductio ad absurdum, reducing to absurdity. Now, Socrates' version is this. His objective essentially was to criticize a definition. So he's trying to disprove a particular position or claim in question. We'll call this, because, philosophers, we like to think of ourselves as being cool like math people and scientists, so we'll use some variables. which everyone hates, but we think we're cool when we're doing it, but we're wrong. So we're looking at claim P. So step 1, assume that claim P is true. Step 2, derive Q from P. Step 3, show that Q is absurd, contradicts P, or contradicts another claim held by the person who claims P. Basically, that would be an inconsistency argument. So it would be an example of this from our good dead friend Socrates. Well, we can go to Plato's, his most famous work, The Republic of Plato. And one of the characters is Thrasymachus, talking about justice. And Thrasymachus claims that justice is this. It is to do what is in the interest of those in power. So to be just is to obey the laws of those in power. But Socrates brings up the following, point. People in power can make a lot of mistakes. And they might, out of error, even though they're intending to advance their own interest, they may make laws that are actually not in their own interest. So obeying those laws is not acting in accord with the interest of those in power. So this would lead to a contradiction. Being just would be to do what is in the interest of those in power, and also to do what is not in the interest of those in power. So the definition is flawed. Another example, back in the ancient days when I was in grad school, back in Ohio, we were having a discussion in the TA room. TAs are teaching assistants, basically minions for professors, doing a lot of work, getting paid little. Probably familiar with that particular kind of scenario because that's, well, anyways, on to the oppression thing. We were talking about oppression. What is the definition of oppression? And one person advanced, a seemingly sensible definition, which is this. Oppression is a mistreatment by the majority of a numerical minority. Now, in the face of it, that does seem to work, because when you typically think of, oppression in the United States, it's usually numerical majority mistreating numerical minorities. However, it's pretty easy to reductio this. One easy way is this. Although more males are born than females, the survival rate of males is lower. Have you ever seen Jackass 3D, or YouTube videos involving shopping carts and rockets? You would see why males tend to make it less, survive less. And so women are actually a majority, slight majority, but a majority. And so on that definition, as long as women are a majority, they can never be oppressed. Likewise, if you look back in history to South Africa, you had a white minority engaged in inflicting apartheid on a black majority. And so under the definition that oppression is mistreatment of minority by numerical majority, they wouldn't be oppressing, which of course is clearly absurd. And so that would make the definition flawed. And so that is the Socratic method of argumentation and finding flaws in definitions. And again, this is something that is not just, left in the far ancient past that can only be used in ancient Greece by Socrates. As I mentioned in your typical basic logic or critical thinking course, we still go over assessing definitions this way. And a bad definition, can be circular, or rather a better way to put it is, if a definition is circular, it's bad. If a definition takes the part to be the whole, it's bad. And if a definition just gives you a list, which gives you no understanding of the common property, it's going to be a bad definition. With some notable exceptions, because there are cases when you do have to use an argument, but rather use examples. And the reductio ad absurdum still works just as well today as it did thousands of years ago for our good dead friend Socrates. And next, we'll take a look at the Socratic method, part 3, the method of counter-example.